Welcome everyone to CSI Skill Tree. In this series, we take a close look at video games and consider the work they do in envisioning the future and building rich, thought-provoking worlds. My name is Joey Eshrick at Arizona State University's Center for Science and the Imagination, and I'll be your host. Today, we're going to talk about Signs of the Sojourner, a game originally released in the spring of 2020. After a successful crowdfunding campaign, the game was developed by a small team at Echodog Games. It was directed by Dyala Kattan-Wright, with collaborators including Holly Rothrock, Zach Vinless, and Kevin Snow. Signs of the Sojourner was nominated for the Excellence in Design Award at the Independent Games Festival in 2021, and you can play it on all kinds of devices, so Windows, Mac computers, PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo Switch consoles. It's kind of like an everything platform situation. The game is set in a somewhat hazily sketched post-crash future. It seems that escalating environmental challenges have caused depopulation and disconnection in a fictionalized version of the US Southwest. Your character's mother has died. You've inherited her store in Bartow, a tiny community on the verge of collapse. And you're looking for things to sell at the store. So you take a series of 5 road trips with a caravan. We'll talk more about that. You navigate them using a map-like interface. You visit a handful of towns over the course of the game. Some of those are bustling. Some are nearly abandoned. Some are more like ruins. You talk to people who live and trade in those towns. If they take a shine to you, they might sell you something. They might decide not to. They might add new paths to your map or tell you about a shortcut or a hazard on the road. They might become your friends. They might provide glimpses into this future world. They might tell you something about your mom who you don't know as much about as you'd like. Some of them find you off-putting. They might disagree with you. They might argue with you. They might stomp off. You might put your foot in your mouth. This is all done through deck building, through cards. During conversations, you choose cards that align with different emotional tones and perspectives. You might be empathetic in one conversation and direct in another. The outcomes of those conversations then determine the fate of your store and perhaps the town you live in as a whole. The game raises a bunch of thematic questions. We're going to try to talk about those today. What does it mean to be in a community? What is a community like? The dynamics of infrastructure and commerce, and the trade-offs that we make to earn money and survive amidst hardship and friction. It plays with ideas about like what a good conversation is and how dialogue might serve as a foundation for building trust and forging meaningful relationships. And it's a difficult game, at least it was for me. It continually presents you with tough choices about which people and places to learn about and build affinity with, and which you just don't have time and energy for, or maybe you just lack the right tools to connect with people. And I found myself not ending conversations always on the right foot and was frustrated by that. But we'll talk more about it. It's a sort of useful and productive frustration, I think. To dig into all of this heady stuff further, I'm fortunate to have 2 really amazing guests. The first is Leigh Alexander. Leigh is a award-winning writer working at the intersection of technology and storytelling. And hi, Leigh.
Hi.
Leigh is a narrative designer for games, a fiction author, an acclaimed critic of play, media, and culture, and a consultant on how to tell stories through design and interactive media. She's written for a number of games that I have enjoyed and admired, including Reigns, Her Majesty, Reigns, Game of Thrones, Love Island, Neocab, and Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. Her fiction has appeared in Slate, actually as part of our Future Tense fiction series, as well as the anthology Resist, Tales from a Future Worth Fighting Against. And Leigh's journalism and criticism have appeared in BBC's Radio 4, as well as Slate, Gizmodo, The Guardian, and New York Magazine. So glad to have you here,
Sound
Leigh.
great. Thanks, Joey.
What a CV, I know.
Yeah. Oh, no, that was a wonderful intro. Thank you so much. And it was such a pleasure working with you on Future Tense.
That story is called The Void. People should seek it out. It's really good. And I could say that because I didn't have to do that much to it. It came in so beautifully.
Thank you.
So I'm also delighted to be joined by Mia Armstrong-López. Mia, hi, Mia. Mia is a managing editor at Arizona State University, where she coordinates editorial projects on health science and justice. And she also collaborates with researchers at ASU and elsewhere to translate their work into essays and articles that reach the general public. Mia's writing has been featured in national and international outlets, including the New York Times, Slate, the Marshall Project, Letras Libres, Nexos, and Reforma. She's taught journalism, English, and writing at universities in Mexico and the US, as well as prisons in Arizona. And she holds degrees in journalism and international relations from Arizona State and is a Fulbright Garcia Robles grantee. Another banging CV. Hi, Mia.
Thank you. Hi, Joy.
So yeah, I'm very excited to get into the game. And so without further ado, I just think we should do that. Mia, I'm going to kind of pick on you first. So
Sure.
could you tell us a little bit more about the game? I know I've sort of tried to set the table a little bit, but what kind of story is it telling, and like what are you actually up to as you're playing cards and exploring this environment?
Yeah. So I think you set it up really well. When I was thinking about how I would characterize it in a couple words, I would say, as you started getting at, it's a story of surviving with limited resources. It's a story with a sort of backdrop of grief, right? We have the death of the protagonist's mother, and then there's also some community grief, I think, right? We have communities that are struggling to survive for economic reasons, that are struggling to survive for environmental reasons. And it's sort of about the relationships that one builds to make it through those sorts of times. So as you mentioned, the character, their task is to keep the store that the mother left behind alive and thriving. And in keeping the store alive and thriving, what the character is really doing is it's keeping the city, Bartow, on the map of the caravan, which is very important, right? It's important that the caravan passes through this city for the city's overall economy. And there's sort of this lingering threat that if the store doesn't do well, they're going to cut it from the caravan route, and that's going to have these sorts of ripple effects on the community's economy. And so you have the main character setting out, going along the caravan route, obviously sort of new at this, trying to live up to their mother's legacy on the route, which was sort of looming and a big shoes to fill. Playing card games with characters that they meet along the way in order to try and get these goods to fill the store, to keep the store and thus the city vibrant. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's really, when I think about it, it's as I said, a story of surviving with limited resources and sort of the relationships that you need to build to do that.
Yeah, I wanted to invite you, Leigh, if you wanted to add anything to what you think the foundation of this game is, or what the kind of the DNA of it is in some sense.
Oh, wow. So, I mean, I guess I definitely look at it from the position of a narrative designer and as a writer of and a passionate player of interactive fiction. And I'm really interested in the way that games have been used, often using text to sort of model and simulate social conflict and the lack of consensus. And there's all kinds of games, obviously, that are about relationship building or about negotiation or about conversation. And I think, to me, these are kind of mechanics that are really complicated in games, and therefore they tend to be kind of experimental. And people like myself, or like I imagine the designers of this game, are just kind of really interested in digging into innovative ways to use game mechanics to kind of simulate the trials and tribulations of living in a society. And that's complicated work, right? Because when we play video games, we generally expect to succeed. The promise that is offered by a video game is that, like, if we learn its vocabulary and we can repeat that vocabulary back well enough, then we will get what we want. For example, one really crude example in the interactive fiction genre is dating games, which generally you give characters like items that they want, and you increase their relationship with them, and you like them more, and then they do what you want. So what I think is super interesting about this game is that it's using the design space to inherently explore kind of how impossible that fantasy of making everybody like you is. And I think the way that the card system works around accommodation and around consensus and around how it really, I think, tries to, through design, systematize the complex experience of agreement, and how the process of seeking agreement on a one-to-one level, how does that complemented by, as well as conflicting with, the desire to sort of assure this larger ecosystemic goal, which is whatever you feel like you want to do with the caravan route. So as a player, I feel like you're given a bunch of objectives. It's like, you're diving into this land and you're finding out who people are and what they're dealing with, but you're also kind of following the trail of your own history, who's your dad and like what happened to your mom and all of this stuff. And those objectives are not always compatible. You're given a lot of sort of latitude, I think, to sort of choose who you sympathize with and make your choices on that basis. And the writing in the game is kind of a little nudge that kind of clues you in toward like, well, it looks like you should be able to do it this way. But the card system kind of provides this disruptive element that I think like really effectively simulates how frustrating negotiation can be. And I think a lot of people say like, oh, this game is frustrating because I can't win at all the conversations and I feel that I'm failing. But I think that is precisely the experience that it is sort of intending to use design to simulate. And so for me, it really raises a bunch of interesting questions about narrative games. Like, is it all about fulfilling the fantasy of achieving harmony? Or are we actually trying to use game design and the interactive medium to say interesting things about how complicated that is? And I think games are at their best when a simulation is complex enough to illustrate why we can't always get our way with everyone. And to me, that's like, from a design standpoint, that's really sort of the essence of what this is. And I think like these successive frustrations you experience when you may play a card and hope that the other character will play a card that matches and therefore achieve consensus. And maybe I'm getting ahead of myself because we haven't explained
That's
the mechanics.
exactly what we should start to get into. I think here. Yeah.
So after that intro, let's maybe talk about how this consensus is simulated. If you or Mia would like to go next.
I'll jump in a little bit, but Mia, I'd love to see this as kind of like starting a pathway that you continue to walk down.
Sure.
So yeah, so you have a deck of cards in this game, and then your counterparts, your interlocutors, I guess, that you meet in these different towns who might be selling you things, or might just be like shady characters or friendly folks or someone who wants to tell your fortune. They all have decks of cards too. And on the cards are shapes, and those shapes go with a variety of kind of emotional tones or stances that you can take to the conversation, you might say. So, you start off, and I believe it's logical and diplomatic, and which is a green triangle, and empathetic and observant, an orange circle. And that's your deck's dominated by those cards. And those actually match the personality of your best friend in your hometown, Elias. And other people are going to have different symbols. Most people have two, but it's not always the case. There's some variations. And what that means is, and to move the conversation forward, you have to match the symbols in various ways. And then the mechanics get more complicated, and they add layers as the game goes on. The other wrinkle is that you're building your deck as you go. So after every conversation, you are required actually to take a card from the other person's kind of worldview from maybe just directly from their deck and add it to yours. And sometimes that could be a big boost, but sometimes depending on how things go, that it can be difficult because you have a pretty small deck. It's only like a dozen cards or so, and you can end up with a kind of motley crew of different emotional tones, and you have to be consistent as you go through these conversations, as you try to match symbols and build a chord, as you all put it. And yeah, so sometimes things just don't go terribly well. The other thing I'll say, and Mia, I'd like to hand it over to you at this point, is you see the other person's side of the conversations, and they each have delightful sound design that kind of represents their voices non-verbally as they talk. Your character, you don't see their responses, and all you get to dictate is the order in which you're going to play the cards you draw. And so that means that you have to, in some ways, fill in the blanks about what an empathetic response, or what a creative and industrious response, or what a direct and forceful response means in a particular set moment. And you can kind of limit what your characters put across by how the other person responds to you, but it leaves a huge space for imagination. Yeah, I'd like to hear more what you think about the game's kind of the mechanics, but also how it dovetails with a kind of model for conversation, I guess.
Yeah, no, I thought it was really interesting that sort of the assumption, at least in my read, that the game was building off of is that it's good to mirror other people's communication style in order to have a productive conversation, right? So if the person that I'm talking to is playing a logical and diplomatic card, then I should play a logical and diplomatic card, and that is what is going to build a productive conversation. And I think that's sort of like an interesting, I mean, it is a logical thesis and a thesis that in many ways I share about communication. But I do think that there's some like nuance and complexity there of like, can we still have a productive conversation if you're playing a logical and diplomatic card and I'm playing an empathetic and observant card? So I thought that was sort of an interesting reflection on the way that we communicate with each other. The one exception is, at least in my gameplay, is the dog, right? The dog just has like a rainbow symbol, and you can play any card with the dog and you'll have a productive conversation. Although there is actually another more serious exception, which is at some point in the gameplay, you can earn what they call an accord. So if you sort of have a streak of playing cards that match with the person that you're discussing with, then you can kind of build up what they call an accord, which essentially like blocks against kind of future disagreement, right? If the next cards that you play do indeed clash or are not matching, then it doesn't kind of dock you as it would normally. And so that was an interesting reflection, I think, also of the ways that we really communicate with each other, which is that once you've sort of established trust or a baseline, then you have more buffer room, right? Than to maybe have a harder conversation or to have a spot where those styles are mismatching. And I thought it was an interesting, as you mentioned, right? Like what we're doing throughout these conversations is we're learning more about the characters that we are encountering along the way, and we're sort of filling in the blanks for ourselves in these conversations. And so as a player, that sort of had two effects for me. I think the first effect was it in some senses, it sort of made me antsy to just like skip through the dialogue. I want to play by cards, right? Like there's a lot of chit chat going on. But on the other hand, right, if you're in a more reflective and patient stance, it lets you really sort of fill in a lot of the blanks for your own character and insert yourself into that character, right? We, as you mentioned, we know very little about the character. We don't really know their gender. We don't know their name. We start building more information.
Yeah, they have
along
cat
the way.
ears. That's very important.
They have cat ears, right?
They have cat ears, and that's very good. So that's a good start for however you decide to embody that person.
And it's a good sign that they get along with the dog, right? There's some concordance there. No, but yeah, I think, we learn about the character through their interactions with other people, and through the histories that we start to learn about their mother in particular. So yeah, I think that was another interesting element.
Hearing you say that, I was reminded, I read this book when I was in film school about the Western film. And one of the ideas in this analysis of Western films was that Western heroes tend to be sort of taciturn, right? The kind of John Wayne model, whatever. Even especially Eastwood, right? The kind of fistful of dollars, that sort of poker face character. But that what the films do is they model, this philosopher argued, something very real about society, which is that you learn more about people from how others react to them than about things they say about themselves. And that, in fact, the Western distrusts bluster. It distrusts what people say about themselves. And it is more about how people react and about what you do. And this game is sort of a 21st century Western in some sense, with a very transformed social sensibility and politics and aesthetic, but perhaps it partakes in some of those Western tropes, which is just to say that it's very deeply rooted perhaps in other genres and cultural artifacts too, to make meaning and connect with the audience. Leigh, I feel like you're about to say something.
Oh no, I really wanted to say that I love your sort of categorization of this as a sort of Western, like, it's you're kind of like you're a lone traveler, you're, navigating the map, and you're making an impression on people everywhere you go, and you're sort of kind of developing this legend of who you are and what you've done. And yeah, I think if I had to speculate, I think like as a genre, and of course having gone to film school, you can fill me in, but like as a genre, like Westerns are kind of like, you know, who are you when the world is in disorder, and what kind of responsibility do you know, what is your orientation to a world that is either new or in flux or in disorder? And you know, how are you creating your own individual story through the choices you make at a time when there are not a lot of, you know, choices. And so I think that kind of vibe sort of really suits this well, I think. Yeah, I just wanted to say I really like that.
Thanks. It was a total, I just inspired by the way Mia described the game. I was like, oh, wow, this is really connecting. But I think the other thing, well, the other thing that's very Western about it is the caravan, which, I mean, part of that perhaps, gets us into the, when we're talking about the game's setting and tone, like that there is this kind of anarchist tone to the game. Like there doesn't seem to be, there's an absence of kind of a central authority. And so, everybody is in flux, moving around. Characters literally move towns, like the map kind of gets reconfigured as you go. There's a railroad that's coming through. So now that I'm really talking myself into this as a Western, there's a railroad coming through, and that's like a big trope in American Westerns. And yeah, so I don't know, everybody's kind of like dealing with change and upheaval. And at one point in the game, without spoiling too much, there's a kind of new cataclysm of sorts, and everybody is thrown further into disarray. And in fact, your deck is thrown into disarray. And Mia, that was another thing mechanically I felt like maybe it was worth adding to the chord mechanic. There's a bunch. I don't think we need to list them all, but there's a fatigue mechanic. So the longer your trip is, the more you get these fatigue cards, which are horrible because they just spoil whatever conversation you're in. You sometimes have to burn them, but they move you towards a unsatisfactory ending to a conversation or a conflictual ending. And your dog helps you get rid of fatigue sometimes, and sometimes you get lucky and there's other events that pop up. The other thing is these grief cards, which show up at a certain point. So there's this game's adding to the implicit model of conversation that I was referring to is the idea that things you bring into the conversation and deficits you might have on a given day, or disruptive and traumatic feelings that you might have, might make it harder to connect with people. So I feel like that's another kind of wrinkle that gets added as time goes on, just as you're getting used to getting to know people and getting them to trust you and sell you things. You get some left turns thrown at you in that sense.
Yeah, and I think, even in sort of the framing of some of the conversations, right, there are instances where I remember a conversation with the friend, Elias, and he says something along the lines of like, I don't even know why we're fighting, right? And it's sort of like and I think sometimes we as humans in real conversations, we get into that stance, right? Where it's like, wait, I don't even understand how we can diagnose this sort of like separation. And there's another kind of framing. I think this is with Nadine, who is like the leader of the caravan. And she's saying something along the lines of like, oh, we're really just talking past each other, right? We're not even able to be in the same lane or canal of conversation. And I think that is where, for me, when I started, after playing the game, I started thinking about my real conversations in this way of like stepping back and being like, oh, am I mirroring this feeling? Am I mirroring this approach? Is this person reflecting back to me the way that I am engaging in this conversation? And the card play is a really interesting way to visualize that and actually be able to like diagnose like, oh, this is where the split happened, right? This is where we started going on different roads. So I found that to be a really useful way to get back to what Leigh was saying about sort of modeling the ways that we can't always get what we want in real conversations or interactions with people. I found that tool and those mechanics of the game like really translatable to the conversations and interactions I have in off the computer.
Leigh, I wonder if I could prompt you to just I don't know, think out loud a little bit about and give us some context about the way this kind of system differs from what we might be more familiar with from, I don't know, like bigger games that involve role playing, which is to say that you get to pick a verbal response to a conversation and then see your character animated. I mean, you might see this. We talked about the game Mass Effect Andromeda in the series previously, and that's certainly an example of that. But the Fallout games, there was that successful TV show recently. Like they have these thoroughly written through conversations. And here there's this layer of, I think, friction and abstraction added by the cards. I wonder I don't know what you think about that, because I know you've written for games that have, you know, different kinds of approaches to delivering and choosing dialogue. So yeah, I don't know what's like, how does that differ from a design perspective or from the experience of like having to unlock the game in some sense as a player?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, this is very different. And I think people who work specifically in narrative genres are constantly trying to kind of innovate in terms of taking, you know, interactive social design beyond like what you would call the standard and into more experimental simulation territory. So I guess to answer your question, probably the standard way that most people think about relationships in games or even language in games is through choice trees. Like the standard way is that you're offered dialogue, you're given a few ways of how to respond, and then you get a result. And that's sort of basically, you know, dialogue choice is considered like the classic and most sort of relatable foundation for how we do this. And, you know, some of the sort of limitations there are that it's sort of not that expressive on the player's part, for one thing, if you have to choose between a number of fixed responses. Of course, this is a very complicated topic. There's also a lot of contexts where constraint is really valuable. And you know, for example, in Disco Elysium, you are not playing in Disco Elysium, that is a dialogue-driven game with standard choice, where you are actually not playing a pie in the sky version of yourself. You are playing a character who is like a recovering alcoholic, or well, semi-recovering alcoholic and addict with amnesia. And it's not that you have free reign to make him into whoever you think he should be. It's more that you are using the dialogue system to kind of navigate the possible interpretations of this person, or you know, within the range of who this character is, there are several ways he could choose to express himself. And I find that really interesting when we're using choice to explore a defined possibility space. But other games are operating on the mandate that the player is having a fantasy, like you mentioned Fallout. If you're role playing, that means, you know, you should theoretically have options that cater to your desire to play a role. So, you know, you want to use a crude example, have the ability to be nice or the ability to be mean, like in Mass Effect, the Paragon and Renegade kind of paradigm. And what ends up happening is, like, we as a standard in games, we tend to offer the player 3 choices, and one is a nice choice and one is a mean choice, and then there's usually kind of like a split the difference milquetoast choice. So already we're seeing that when we have an empty possibility space and only 3 choices for role play, every player is going to be frustrated, and every player is going to end up feeling like their desired self-expression is kind of not being accounted for by the game. And specifically in games about relationships, I was just looking up a reference. There's a game that was made in a jam in 2013 that I still think about all the time. It's by Arden Ripley, and it is called Kindness Coins. It's a short little game that is kind of, I guess satire is too strong a word, but it intends to explore how dating sims work by, like, basically pumping in, telling the other character what they want to hear and giving them what they want until they kind of are willing to hook up with you in the case of a dating sim. And this has obviously been criticized because relationships do not work this way. They're not about, relationships are fluid and complex, and it's not just about constantly making someone like you more and more and more until they like you the most. Yeah, so relationships in general are very hard to systematize in a way that is accessible through game design. So I think, like, the standard model of, I only have a few choices on how to resolve this is I only have a few choices on how to resolve this situation, or I have a really open possibility space about who I'm going to be, or there is a metric for success that I can achieve by playing this well. And I think that Signs of the Sojourner takes this promise of the metric of success, and like, I will be able to get all the right cards and I will be able to win all these conversations, and it intentionally frustrates those expectations. And while it's doing so, it uses the mechanical elements that you mentioned emotion, for example, like each symbol representing an emotion or an intention. And then there's other, there'll be symbols on the cards that indicate that they do further special things. You mentioned accord, which, means that you will agree on the successive card, regardless of what it is. Then there's like accommodation, where it's just like, they will let it slide if you disagree, I think. That's what it does. It's been a minute. So these are aspects of consensus and aspects of relationship building that are simulated through this language of cards and symbols in a way that I think is quite open-ended and open to the player's interpretation. And Mia was saying that her experience with the game had led her to kind of think about her conversational behavior differently. Like, what is the other person's motive? Like, what is in their metaphorical hand? Are we simply mirroring each other, and does that count as accord? When we conflict, is that a failure? Am I frustrated, and why? Why have I failed in this conversation? Is it because I have a hand that's way too broad, and therefore I can't satisfy any one person? Does having a hand that's full of chaos like symbolize that you don't know who you are and what you want to say? So what I think is really cool about this game is that the card mechanics and the symbols and this particular system of pursuing accord is really different, I think, from the standard model of relationships that promise that you can advance by making the right choices in a closed situation. So it's kind of open and expressive, and my favorite kind of narrative games are like this, where the system is perhaps a bit experimental, but for me as a player, it provokes the thought in this theoretical space of like, what is accord, and who am I, and why is this working, and who am I working with, and toward what end? So I think like this potential for complex systemic conflict, I think really it sets this apart from other narrative driven games that are choice driven in a static way, or that are trying to satisfy a particular player fantasy that they can achieve. This is not about like, how do you win the situation? This is like, you could choose your objective in this situation and try to achieve that. Like, what are you looking for? What do you want? Like, do you want, yes, if you leave this town, if you don't succeed with this caravan, your town might be wiped off the map and you can't live there anymore. But maybe that's okay if you're now on the road. Maybe you found a new home. Is it okay to leave? Like, these are interesting questions. And it's like the game is not going to push you down the path toward one of these outcomes. You as a player start making decisions, consciously or otherwise, regarding who you're going to be in this world and what you want, what your emotional state is, and what your general approach to negotiating with others is. And so I think, even though, at times there's frustration because you can fail, or because, the other player is, I'm digressing now, but one thing that is interesting here is that you're seeking accord with the other player, and they're just playing whatever card they have next. Like, what do they want from you? I'm always wondering, like, don't you also, why wouldn't you play your triangle? Don't you also want to agree? And that kind of raises, to me, in a really interesting question, is very close to what real life is like. What is their motivation in saying that to me? And that's not something that we can kind of simulate flexibly in games that easily. That was quite a long answer, but it was a complicated question.
Yeah, I was just like, what's up with game design, the question. So that's pretty rough. My bad. But no, I feel like I learned a lot there. Thank you so much. It makes me reflect on my own experience of play, which, like, one of the first hurdles I had to get over as I was kind of metabolizing this game was like, oh, well, if I'm just empathetic and diplomatic all the time, shouldn't everyone like me? But again, that's like, it is a statement about the designer's interpretation of what real life is like, which is like, you might think you're presenting yourself beautifully and being as understanding as possible, and you might just like rub someone the wrong way. Like, that's the productive frustration, is like, you can't just like, nice answer your way into being the most popular person in the desert in this game. And that, then rewards multiple playthroughs, rewards experimentation, rewards some reflection about what you're trying to accomplish, like you said, Leigh. One thing I wanted to circle back to as we were talking about the rudiments of this game is something Leigh brought up, which is just that, like, the game gives you a lot of things to do. It gives you a lot of different things to optimize for as you explore and play, and you don't have that much time. You're limited sort of in the number of actions you can take, because you have these 5 road trips that you can take. And you can truncate them, or you can make them as long as possible, but you can learn about your mom. You can optimize for that. You can optimize for exploring as much of the map as possible. You can optimize for seeing specific events. Maybe there's like a barbecue going on in a town that you hear about, and you're like, I want to go to the barbecue. I don't care about anything else. Maybe you want to unravel a mystery. There's a variety of mysteries along the way. Maybe you want to really go at there's kind of one like bad guy in the game that's this like nefarious rich family. Maybe you want to go at them and see if you can kick them in the teeth, or maybe you just want to like hang out with your friend as much as possible. These are all like things you can do. And your friend Elias, like if you want to be a homebody, you can like keep your trips nice and short. Although he doesn't love that. He also wants to play a concert. And I was like, both times I failed to get him an instrument. And so he had to play this plastic recorder. I felt super bad for him because I was like missing something. But yeah, it was like, there's all this stuff that you can almost short circuit all these larger goals to just be like, I just want to see the thing. And I think that feels very real too, is that like the economy of the game, you can say. This game doesn't have money per se, it's all barter, but like the economy is your time and the information that you have access to. So yeah, I don't know. That's what that made me think of but I wondered what the two of you thought about that aspect where, this notion of giving you kind of an open board. The other thing is I would say none of those seem terribly morally weighted. Staying with the caravan or not, it's not clear there's like a good choice or like a lawful, good, nice option. Maybe it's cool to leave the caravan, and sometimes your nice friends will ask you to do things for them that require departing from the caravan, but then the caravan doesn't like that. But it's like, the caravan's kind of not good or bad. They're pretty neutrally balanced. So it did clash with some of my experiences of, let's say, just like more traditionally scoped games where it's like, it's pretty clear when you're like being a nice person or being a mean person. And like here it was like, well, I don't know what like the nice thing to do is, but it's more about like curiosity perhaps in the design.
Yeah, I mean, I was reflecting and resonating a lot when Leigh was talking about this idea of what is the end. And I'm someone who hasn't played many video games at all. Like I could probably list on one hand I could tell you right now the number of video games that I've played. And so I went into the game with this strategy of like, or the stance of like, okay, how is this game won, right? Like what are the steps that one has to take to win this game, right? Which is obviously a very simplistic characterization to go into this with, but as someone with very little experience in games, that was sort of my framing. And so the first couple of rounds of the caravan were very frustrating because in my mind, I was like, I feel like I don't have the tools to win. How does this work? I'm doing the best I can. I'm clearly missing something. And then I felt like, well, this is clearly there's something that's more obvious to people who play more games, but that isn't obvious to me. And then as I went on, I sort of like got clued into the like, oh no, this is just sort of an exploration. It's sort of a journey driven by curiosity. And I think I hope this isn't spoiling to say, but at the end, I sort of, the first time I played the game, I sort of failed with the store, right? Like I wasn't able to get all of the elements that I needed to keep the store alive. And so like there was this sort of backdrop of fear during that whole first round of game that like, oh, if you don't keep the store alive, then the town is going to suffer, right? And that's going to be super destructive to the entire economy and community within your town. But what ended up happening is like the store failed, but the town was fine. And sort of like there had been some community resilience built up in the town that was like, oh no, actually like we're going to be okay. We're going to be able to adapt. And so that was interesting to me because I think it reflected this idea of sometimes we have this weight of like, if I do not do this thing, or I am responsible for the survival or collapse of my community. And really, that's not what community is about, right? Community is about we can all be responsible for the survival of collapse of our community. And it shouldn't depend on any one person's ability to like get some wine and pickles from the town next door, right? So I thought that was really interesting. And then just the other thing that I was reflecting on is I think at the beginning of the game, there was this sort of sense that there should be distrust, that you should like distrust people out on the road, right? Like that starts even with your friend, Elias, he says, like, I don't trust Nadine, who is sort of the leader of the caravan. And then, Nadine tells you not to trust other people, and the people that you're interacting with on the road are like, oh, you got to be really careful about out here. People might not be who they say they are, et cetera, et cetera. At least in my experience, kind of playing through the game, there was always this sort of like shadow or like the big bad people that you should watch out for the shadow of distrust. But there weren't any actual like concrete reasons that I was presented with to distrust people, like in the flesh, right? In terms of people's actual actions, right? There are a couple incidents where folks are like stealing things from other folks, but that doesn't seem like, it almost seems more out of necessity than malicious. And so I thought that was like also an interesting reflection about a lot of times in our relationships with people and in community, like we have these sorts of fogginess around like, oh, we have to be distrustful of folks. But I think that's more kind of a self-spiral of fear often than like, what are the actual actions that are demonstrating reason for distrust?
Yeah, I think that's it's such an interesting point, Mia. You said that because you don't often play a lot of video games, you went into it believing, feeling a high degree of anxiety about your individual responsibility for the situation. And I think that's probably absolutely intentional on the part of the designer. Like, really good games kind of do interesting things with our natural desire to fix and our natural desire to win. And, I kind of came at it kind of differently. Like, I was not as interested in saving the town as I was in like figuring out the world and deciding who I wanted to be friends with. And so like these mandates about, which factions would, an interesting thing about the game is they give you all of this, these warning signs about trust are clues from the system that you can't have it all, and that, you can't be friends with everybody. And if you're aligned with one clan, then, another person might not like you as much. And unfortunately, like, that's just the way it is. And I think Mia's point that like community is not a winnable situation or an individual responsibility situation. I think it feels to me like that was, super intentional on the part of the designers, and that the game does a really good job of actually presenting, in this complex situation, you might have any number of motives, which could be individual. You could be curious about the world. You could be looking for something in particular. You could be, trying to succeed economically for your town. Maybe you want to see all the towns. And I'm sure that there are still other people who just kind of play it like a road trip. Like, how you reach new locations in this game is that someone will tell you about them, or they'll take you there, or they'll ask you for a ride there. So by having conversation, you actually see the world by meeting people, which is kind of an important point, I think. And so for me, like, most of my agenda in conversations with others was like, how do I get to a new place? And I'm just like, I guess that's my Venus Sagittarius. Like, I just, that's how I relate to others, is by discussing travel. And so like, I kind of had this motivation of like, I want to see this world and I want to know who these people are. And I kind of want to choose my friends. But I would often end up like kind of, I had maybe gone too hard ingratiating myself with one group. And then like, it's, I felt social anxiety. Like, Mia was like, I feel like it's on me to save this entire community. I'm like, oh, I feel like I got to make everybody like me. Like, like it activated my people pleasing anxiety. And I felt like I was kind of being critiqued by the game for that. Like, community building is not people pleasing. Community building is making hard decisions about who you are and what you represent, because consensus is not actually possible without a strong sort of individual impetus. And I thought that was kind of really interesting. But I'm a big fan, and this tends to be complicated for people who don't play a lot of video games, but I'm a big fan of like intentionally frustrating the player by using the conventions of success and achievement. Like, I'm going to teach you these rules, go and play, but then you'll gradually realize that you're not going to be good at this no matter how hard you try. And that's the story. You know what I mean? Like, some people find that quite frustrating. But I like that a lot. If I can like talk about a game that I worked on for 1 second real quick, which is also card-based. Reigns Her Majesty is about managing a kingdom by making card-based decisions as a queen. And because it has like, it's very accessible to play. You swipe the cards left and right in a Tinder style interface, and a lot of your kingdom management answers are yes, no answers. There's a simple system of meters. And if you fail to balance your meters, like if one becomes too full or too empty, you die and you start again. However, even though it's a narrative and a dialogue game, we can almost think of it like adjacent to a roguelike, which means that progress is created through death. By dying, you unlock permanent conditions that make it possible for you to see more of the content, basically. And that's a pretty standard model in games. But when I showed Her Majesty to a lot of my friends who don't play video games, despite the fact it was very easy to play, it was hard for them to understand. They said, like, I love your game, but I think I'm so bad at it. I keep disappointing everybody and I keep dying all the time. I'm like, no, you're doing it right. But I think sometimes this can be, we don't see this often in mainstream games because the idea that the player is supposed to be frustrated and shouldn't be having a good time all the time and is supposed to be learning about how difficult things feel. I think that can sometimes be a tough sell for people who don't play a lot of games and who have through their experience been fairly led to expect that like games should just be fun and they should win and they should learn to win and feel good. So yeah, I think this intentional frustration of these individualistic desires, although it could be kind of hostile to non-gamers, I think that's kind of I think that was intentional on the designer's part and it's part of the experience. And again, your mileage may vary on whether you find frustration narratively interesting. But I think, I think that was part of the intention there, which is something I really personally like about this game.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I actually think, Joy, if I can just say
please do.
I would say, like, I think one of the reasons that I don't play more games, or I haven't played more games in the past, is because I have in my mind this idea of like, I'm not good at games, right? Like the idea is to be good at games. And I think a lot of the first games that people get introduced to are like the mass market games. Like you can think, if I were to trace this like idea in my head that I'm not good at games and I therefore don't like games, I would trace it back to like being in middle school and like everyone's playing Mario Kart, right? And then it's like if you're not good at that, then it's very boring, and also it can feel sort of exclusionary, right? Like this is a place where I'm not meant to go, right? And I think because so much of this sort of myth of, sort of this is mainstream gaming, like this is what gaming is, which is certainly a myth, but I think like that idea, I'm not good at games, therefore I'm automatically going to exclude myself from this whole world, is sort of the stance that I have gotten into, and it can feel exclusionary in that way, right? Because why am I going to opt in? I'm not going to know how, I'm not going to be good at it, this isn't for me. And so I actually think like this experience for me of playing a game where I was not good at it, and that was the point, right? Like no one was really good at it, right? It was just sort of like a journey and something that you learn something on. That was like a very different framing of what it means to play a game, and what a game can do in your life, and how it can impact you personally, and then your relationships, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that frame for me was actually more inclusionary and like broadening of this universe of like how someone like me might imagine themselves in a world of games.
Joy, can I just say one more thing on this? Because Mia has said something that I'm very passionate about regarding inclusion. Mia, your experience of being told that, games are not for you, that's kind of largely a gendered experience that a lot of people like, I think it's becoming different for young people today, but most adults that I know have had this experience growing up where there was a sort of monoculture that was hostile to people outside of the dominant paradigm. And I think it's really significant that in this game, we have a lot of diversity in the characters. It's a fantasy world, so you have robots and cat ears, and there are characters who use they pronouns. There are characters dealing with disabilities, and I think again the choice of who to portray in this world was also very intentional, because I think it shows that when you have a monoculture and a dominant heteropatriarchal capitalist paradigm, it's harder for everybody to succeed, and so you have these kind of characters that represent marginalized individuals all dealing with differing notions of success. And I think, that is why inclusivity in the subject matter and the content of games is really important, because from there, I think the inclusivity follows for the audience as well. We wouldn't have as effective a game about, community building if it was about reinforcing status quo. So I think, from a design standpoint, the game makes this kind of revolutionary and inclusive decision, but this is also reinforced on the content side. And the idea of who games are for, how hard they should be, what success should feel like, those are very cultural as well. And games like this sort of disrupt that culture by opening up new definitions of what they can be about and who they can be for and what they can be, what they can feel like. So I just wanted to touch on that. Thanks, Joey.
Oh no, I'm so glad that you did. And I wanted to make sure that at some point we dwell briefly, at least, on the game's visual style and its design, which I think is really distinctive. It has, folks will see some gameplay and stuff, but kind of this hand-drawn aesthetic. And for a game that I think it's a speculative fiction game, and like we've now established, it's also a Western, it upends both of those in the sense that it has this sort of like very analog, hand-drawn, scratchy lines, bright colors. I think the game is very queer and very insistent upon diversity, insistent upon oppositional politics. Like I said, it takes a kind of left anarchism, I think, sometimes as a starting point. There's citizens' assemblies and discussions about labor in the game. So there's that. But then with the Western, it's also it's about collectives. It's not about individuals pulling apart, but it's about collectives of differently valenced people pulling together. And you see in the towns, one of the reasons it's good to play the way Leigh played is that you get to see all the towns, and each of them has a different social configuration and different issues they're dealing with, and differently bodied people, for example. I could never make friends with the android, and I need to play again now to just do that. I'm gonna do like a hard android run and just like get their whole story. But yeah, I think that to me, that felt really distinctive. It was the reason I attended to this game in the first place, was I was like, oh, this is a very a game that is very cognizant of the tropes of the genres that it's playing in, and it's really trying to kind of work against them. And I think the writing's really clever too. Like the characters who represent all of these diverse embodiments and in identity positions and claims are really charming and funny and relatable, and many of them are so generous, or the issues that they have with each other are really complex in a really human way. So like there's a big fight about like whether art should be commodified, and whether artists should be trying to like optimize for making a living versus like whether artists should be trying to keep it weird and like try to express themselves in as unfettered a way as possible. Like, should art be created for the market? I mean, it feels like a very meta game in that sense about it's an indie game about whether indie games, like, where indie games fit in the economy of indie games and all of its troubles. So yeah, anyway, that's just my like kind of soapbox about the visual style and what I think, it's a really beautiful presentation. But yeah, I would wonder how that worked for the two of you, or if there was something that really stuck out, like a particular formal or stylistic choice, because I do think the game makes a big stylistic swing for itself.
Sure, I'll just go very briefly. I think I really resonate with what you just said, Joey, and what Leigh was saying before. I think like the way that the game presents community in terms of the diversity of community and the different visions of community and the people that make up community is something that makes me actually buy into the game's thesis about community, which in my play was like, this is about relationship building, and this is about, it does not depend on just one individual or one decision. It depends on sort of this collective. And I think, Joy, one of the things that you mentioned when we had discussed this before was this idea that it sort of feels like a futuristic version of the American Southwest, potentially, right? Like we have some of these dynamics of water and other sort of kind of environmental tropes there. And I think in the design and the color and the illustration, that really resonated with me. And as someone who's from the American Southwest, it felt like a sort of a realistic and yet hopeful vision of the future, where it is like people kind of come together in this way that makes survival under tricky circumstances kind of more tenable.
And yeah, I think the writing in this game, and this like writing, not just the moment to moment dialogue and the descriptive text, but the characters and as you say, the community dilemmas and the themes about art and the themes about what is important to people in a survival context. I mean, that to me is very impressive. That kind of harmony of like, that's kind of the holy grail of narrative design, is when the game design is expressed in every sort of area like this, visually, through the themes, through the characters, and there's just this great harmony. And I think like one of my when I was really like, oh, this is good, was like really early on. There's this character who's like a nervous painter. I think his name is Tomas.
Tomas,
and yeah, and they're trying to teach you the observe mechanic, which allows you to actually see the other character's hand, and he's like insecure about you sort of looking at his art or something. He's like, okay, I'll just let you quietly engage with the art, and that's intended to encourage you to observe. And when you observe, he opens up to you and you can see his hand. And like that to me is just such a beautiful harmony of mechanics and content. And they didn't have to say like click observe to see Tomas's hand. It was like because of the social context, I understood what I was intended to do. And that to me is just like a really sweet moment when, you know, I feel it's deceptively difficult to do, especially in games where like each individual line of dialogue in Signs of the Sojourner is kind of short. So like to give you enough information to make an emotional choice as well as a mechanically informed decision is kind of like a pretty difficult art in games from a writing standpoint. So I was just super impressed by that. And like, yeah, like game writing that impresses me is not always just about the quality of the language from moment to moment, which this game absolutely has in spades, but also the way that it cues you about the larger ecosystem and what it means and how it is supposed to feel. It gives me enough information to contextualize and reflect on my own choices and to make an interpretation of my own trajectory within this space without it having to be dictated to me. And I think that's really cool. Like a lot of games, like, oh, like, you know, this character will remember what you said, or you've done this. And you know, we need to we're constantly mirroring the player back to them so that they can understand what they're doing in the system. But in this, they really give you the space. And like, it is so visually evocative and it is so queer. It does just sort of inherently prompt like this reflection of who am I and what am I trying to say and who do I want to be? And that's something like just done from this harmony of writing and mechanics that I think is really impressive. So I would call that like a strong stylistic choice for sure. You know, the inclusivity and the empathy and the writing and the humanity and its themes, I think really strong. I love this game so much.
So we're close to out of time, but I did want to ask you both just briefly, and especially, I guess, while I have you here, Leigh, about trauma and about how that comes through in this game. Because I do think we've been talking around this a lot and about it a bit, but this is a game where collective trauma has happened in the game's setup, in the premise. Like you know that something's off. This looks like a sort of post-apocalypse, you know, and you can decide for yourself how optimistic or hopeful it is about that state of affairs. But then something else happens. There's this cataclysm, and it is throws people's, you know, access to resources and environment further into disarray. And I know that you've written, I mean, in When the Water Tastes Like Wine, but I think, you know, in other games too, about precarity, about trauma, and about how that kind of like influences people's behavior and the shape of communities. So yeah, I wondered what you thought about perhaps Signs of the Sojourner alone, or perhaps about more generally about this kind of staging of trauma, and as part of what you're trying to expose the player to, I guess, as we've been talking about kind of the player experience and how you wend your way through all of this.
Well, I've been a woman in the video game industry for about 17 years, so games about navigating complex trauma are my favorite. I'm a lot of fun at parties. But no, for real though, I do think, you know, navigating the aftermath of trauma, we use games to systematize and to simulate things that happen in our real life so we can compartmentalize and understand them. So I think given how trauma is such a nebulous possibility space with no win state, and you navigate trauma and you choose your orientation to it, and deciding who you are through trauma is the only way to kind of win. You're not going to win your trauma. You're never going to get over it. But, you know, it's this permanent state of change that you choose your orientation to. And I do think like, oh, what happened in this world and who do I want to be in this world when something has happened? And just when I figure out who I am, something changes again. And you know, I think like when we think about exploring trauma, what we are exploring is change and how we orient ourselves to change. And I think like, to me, there's no more interesting thing to be making video games about, to take this complex emotional landscape and this kind of universal and unfortunately becoming more universal human experience of wondering how we're going to survive. And having that, you know, like, that's when you really decide who you are. And I think, I really like, I'm not at all interested in personally as a player or as a creator in narrative designs about power fantasy and about gratifying my will or propping up the infrastructure. Like, you know, I want to make choices about how to deal with pain. And I think that's a very powerful opportunity that games offer us is to examine ourselves in orientation to pain. And I think, like, you know, if I were given this game to do, if they approached me with the system and said, like, let's do a narrative design, I too would say, you know, let's show people dealing with, you know, the aftermath of some great change. And if we want to make it about community, you know, what is the threat to community? The threat to community is mass trauma and how we all respond to it differently. So I think that was a really cool thing that this game chose to effectively depict.
Mia, I wanted to invite you to follow that up with any thoughts before we wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there is much that that I could add to that. I mean, I thought that was a wonderful interpretation, and I also, I mean, I think the one thing that I would say is that I think that, as Leigh mentioned, like there are certain different levels of trauma that the characters are navigating, right? Like the game starts from a basis of trauma, which is sort of losing the mother, and then also the ripple effects of that, which is feeling your identity sort of floating and trying to anchor that in some way, which I think is what the character does throughout this relationship building with the people that once had relationships with their mother, right? That there is a sort of underlying trauma to that process, and also an underlying resilience that I think the character builds up. And then we have this sort of event that happens mid gameplay that everyone sort of deals with collectively. But I think that was, for me, a really resonant piece of the game was how we learn more about people over time in their responses to these events, and then how we learn more about ourselves and sort of construct the stance with which we want to then approach the world and other people.
Yeah, thank you both. I really like that, Mia. I do think you get a different perspective on the characters you've chosen to grow close to, or that you've been able to grow close to once the cataclysm happens, because they take actions that, you know, in some cases are quite surprising, or they behave differently towards you for a period of time. So yeah, I think it's really instructive when that happens, and it is the way the game kind of unfolds more of the world and its cast. So thank you both so much for your participation today, for your insights, for your sort of wise readings and interpretations of this game. I feel like I've learned so much about it, and I've got to go play it again and see all the parts I missed. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. To folks watching, to be notified about future Skill Tree episodes, you can subscribe to our channel on YouTube at Imagine ASU, or you can visit our website, csi.asu.edu, where you can subscribe to email updates. You can learn more about Leigh Alexander and her work at leigalexander.net, and you can learn more about Mia and her work at miaarmstrong.com. Oh, there's an extra A in there, miaarmstrong.com, miaarmstrong.com.
I know, it's confusing. It's for my middle name. miaarmstrong.com wasn't available, so I had to go with plan.
Yeah, that would be cheaper, even if they were both available. But yeah, okay, miaarmstrong.com. A lot of A's in a row. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at the Center for Science and the Imagination for making this series possible, and especially to Om Gawali for editing our gameplay video and this episode. So thanks to everyone at ASU who makes this series possible. Leigh, Mia, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you for playing this game with me and talking with me about it.
Thank you, Joey. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much for having me and for all you did to enable and support my participation. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm very honored. Okay, thanks to both of you. Bye.
Thanks. It's been a real pleasure.